No, now I'm recording. Sorry. I knew I didn't do something. Okay. So module 10. So I'm trying to get midterms graded. I apologize. It takes me a long time to go through all the session plans. And to be honest, I can only do a couple and then they start sounding the same and then I can't be objective. I'm not a good grader if I do too many in a sitting. So I'm trying to be done with everybody's midterm by Friday. I know a couple of you guys asked for feedback. If you really need feedback quick, please send me a message. I will get it to you. Auditory processing, I feel like you guys did a really good job on last week's module. So I'm trying to take due dates off. There are still due dates on, for those of you who are on my 212, most of you are, but I'm not counting anything late. So I'm going to take some due dates off. I want us all to get caught up and on the same page. So if you have something that you haven't done from a previous module, please turn it in. I'm not counting anybody late right now. So please don't worry about it. I'm not going to essentially count off anybody late the rest of the semester, except maybe the final, because finals got to be done so I can turn in your grade. But so traumatic brain injury. So I don't know if any of you have any personal experience with traumatic brain injury, but I want to tell you it's probably one of the most can be one of the most rewarding and also the most challenging disabilities. So hang on. What I want to say is that when we're looking at somebody with a traumatic brain injury, there's no two alike. Here we go again, all these disorders with no two alike. There's some general themes, things that are true. And a lot of times too, it's where the extent of the injury, where it was at, and what's their premorbid status. What happened? Where were they at beforehand? So kind of traumatic brain injury, there's two types. There's open brain injury, closed brain injury. So basically, one where the skull was actually open and one where they just had a hit on the outside, but nothing penetrated the skull. So obviously, usually this is what we see resulting from falls. Number one thing I would say, motor vehicle crashes and bike, some kind of what I say transportation. So you're on your scooter, now lately it's been scooters, but scooters, bikes, and dirt bikes and motor vehicle crashes. So definitely kind of the main cause of closed head injury. That's why if you're on any kind of recreational vehicle, all-terrain stuff, wear a helmet. And definitely it's broad. There's usually no penetration of the skull in those closed, well, because it's closed, but in what I would say the transportation accidents. So you kind of look at some of that open, definitely from something penetrating the skull. So bullet wounds, other kinds of what I would call other severe trauma. And the effects can be very serious. Definitely, if not deadly. So definitely some things there that occur. So obviously it's a biological event. There's tissue damage, bleeding, swelling. You kind of look at other things that we see, loss of consciousness, other changes due to the TBI and post-traumatic amnesia. So a lot of times their memory is affected. They don't remember how they hurt themselves. It can definitely lead to problems in functioning. Now, severity is how much brain tissue damage there was. And then kind of when we look at the severity, there's lots of different things. And we look at the length of the post-traumatic amnesia. There's some scales that the hospital will use. And also we look at how long were they out of consciousness. So someone who's been in coma for several weeks, that's different than someone who was out for a few minutes. Definitely some things. So we look at where did they come up on the scale, and we kind of usually come up with a mild, moderate, and severe. And if you look at this, so, greater than 6 hours. So pretty much like a lot of them go from mild to severe. So what happens is they begin to recover. So what we see is we kind of look at what area. Did their speech part get injured? Did their brainstem get injured? Was their vision? So kind of too, when we look at like where did the hit on the head occur, usually we could tell what kind of challenges they might have when they come to. In recovery, here's the challenge for a TBI. It's different for every person and it continues for years. And to me, the longer they were out, and I say out, being in coma, whatever, or that's, you know, semi-vegetative state, definitely the recovery process is longer. So it's multi-stages and it continues for years and it differs for each person. So I'll talk about a student, and in fact, it's great. She's a student I've kept in contact with after she graduated. And she's, you know, her mid-20s now. She was an honor student before, super, you know, highly motivated, highly competitive. She was in a very, very, very serious car accident. She's lucky she survived. She had a lot of other bodily injuries to deal with after. She was in a coma for, I think, 7 weeks total before she woke up. And she changed a lot. You know, she had injury to her whole side, definitely some processing challenges. I mean, I was worried. I wasn't sure she was even going to be really functioning anywhere close to where she was before. And, you know, she missed almost an entire year of school because of, you know, the accident happened on her birthday, you know, her being what I would call careless, a very sad, careless teenager mistake that she paid dearly for. She paid dearly for it legally. She paid dearly for it emotionally, physically, in every way which you can pay. And when I look at her recovery, I started seeing her as a sophomore, and then even as a senior, she still was making gains. She still was in recovery. And I just remember we had a kind of heated discussion, and she'd be very agitated. She'd be volatile. I was in a meeting with her parents, who were phenomenal people. And, you know, I remember, you know, yelling at her. She was yelling at me. And I just kind of snapped. I'm like, you know, you're still in recovery. Like, you shouldn't be doing all these things. Like, your parents are right. And I was telling her, like, her recovery was going to be a long, long time. In fact, now when I talk to her, she's like, you know, there's still things I'm still gaining. Like, she's 25 now. And this happened when she was 16. And she's like, there's still things I'm still improving. So it can go on for a very long time, as well as too, like, I think given her age, she has more what I would call resiliency, and that those brain pathways are open to some changes. So I think that's why she still is having positive responses. But I've also seen where just the gains are so small, it's not impactful after a period of time. So what's the long term? You know, so some things too, we look at, how did they recover physically? Do they have, you know, someone's in a motor vehicle accident, they had a head injury, did they become a paraplegic? Did they lose, you know, a limb? Did they have other kind of, you know, damage done to, like, let's say an arm or hand that they can't really regain use of? So, or vision problems, things like that. So definitely we have to look at what damage occurred and what's the possibility of rehab for that. So obviously, number one thing that's usually affected in a TBI is cognition. So, and that's hard because I think that's a harder thing to measure. We can measure arm strength, leg strength, you know, physical recovery that we can gauge. You know, like this girl, she burned the heck out of her leg. She had to have lots of, you know, skin grafts and stuff. And that took years and lots of physical therapy to rehab and gain full use of her legs and walk again. So, you know, what are their other physiological recovery, not just their cognition? And then when you look at the functions of cognition and cognitive, when we say that, you know, I just think of the brain. What are all the things the brain do? That's attention, concentration, memory, processing, speed of processing, that impulsiveness, that especially you get hit in the frontal lobe, you can bet there's some. And what's really hard, I think, for those people that have kind of two areas, they get a bad hit in the front and a bad hit in the back, or you hit in the front and the side. So then you hit the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. And that's just, there's lots of factors there. So looking at that, knowing the extent of the brain damage, we can usually predict or know some challenges they might have. Definitely some sensory stuff. So we often see maybe they didn't have that before, but now after the traumatic brain injury, some more sensory challenges, and I would call it maybe sensory processing, but I feel like it's not a dysfunction, it's from brain damage. Definitely we see after traumatic brain injuries, issues with vision, hearing, smell, vestibular big time. So anybody who's had a blow to the side of their head, sometimes they get tinnitus, you know, that ringing in the ears, have a poor sense of balance. Their taste can absolutely be affected as well as their smell, but the balance is challenging. So if anybody who's had that, now now they're a risk for falling. Now they're a falling risk. Now other things they've never had to consider, like the environmental factors of what's safe and not safe for them. Definitely. I know I worked in the rehab hospital in Ohio, and this person lived in a like a loft. It's like on the cliff that overlooked, you know, had a nice view of the river. If the Ohio River is pretty, but at least the city part was pretty. And he had a loft that where his bed was. So he had this like kind of big one, what I would call studio, kind of what I would call urban place. Well, he was not safe to go and sleep in the loft, like going up the ladder after his motorcycle accident. I remember we had a lot of talk with the family about how he was not safe to go and try to get up the top of his, you know, loft where his bed was. Very unsafe. Seizures. And this is what we also see. Sometimes after traumatic brain injury, they didn't have seizures and now they do. So those are some things really we need to have some good medical background on after a traumatic brain injury. Like I said, there's other physical changes as well as what I would say if there's spasticity or paralysis. So sometimes they don't have, it's not that they're paralyzed, they have what we call spasticity. So then there's been damage to the nerves, so they don't quite have what I would call the typical functioning. It might function, but it might be slow, it might be labored, it might be, they don't have that strength anymore. Yeah, chronic pain. Did they have other, you know, damage to their bowel or bladder? And those are kind of new things that maybe they never encountered before. Lots of sleep issues, loss of stamina. So that's what we see, traumatic brain injury. And I can speak most of my experience. Like I said, I've had some adult experience, but that's been long time, you know, 2003, 2004, since I've worked with, you know, adults in motor vehicle accidents, which was predominantly the group I got. But the teenagers it's just teenagers already have sleep challenges for a variety of reasons. And then you add a TBI on top of that. Definitely, I had one student, he could not come to, he was never going to make a 7:30 class. He was never going to make, he was lucky if he made it to his 9:15 class, and just really kind of altering his day so he could come to school and not be, counted it, have it work against him. But appetite changes, we see a lot of times regulation of body temperature. And obviously for women, there are gonna be menstrual difficulties because the variety of damage, where it is, and then our hormones and things that regulate that. And that kind of goes along with like regulation of body temperature. We definitely see some of those changes. That's stamina, appetite, menstrual difficulties, as well as body temp. Social emotional stuff, for sure. I can go on for a long time about that. And then obviously there's physical recovery versus helping the client understand their injury and what they endured, as well as how do we modify their environment. And that's, well, hold on, I want to say too, a lot of times when we look at permanence of change, so what changed? And is this something that's going to be, so if somebody was ambulatory and now they are confined to a wheelchair, that's a big change in their environment, and the possibility of them not getting out of a wheelchair, that's very different than someone who is temporarily in a wheelchair. So those are some challenges, definitely a challenge in mindset for a family. And you kind of look at what happens with mild or minor TBI. Now, what I think happens though is sometimes you miss, if it's a mild TBI, we don't see the changes or the differences. Now, the group that's at a high risk for this, and I would say a series of minor ones can become bigger ones. And I think we're getting more information and understanding of that CTE, so that post-concussion syndrome, definitely looking at repeated injuries. So who's at risk for that? So you look at kids who played football, hockey is another one, even something simple like soccer. I think if they've been in a high risk activity for what I would call concussion, which we would call a concussion a mild injury. But what we do know is that they engage in those activities, they have one, they're likely to have others, and then the conglomerate of mild building up can really cause what I would call some long-term impact. So even someone who's had an injury, we had a teacher suffer a extensive concussion. I've had 2 teachers this year have a concussion. I mean, the pandemic has just brought all kinds of different scenarios to a school-based setting that I myself in my 25th year have never experienced until this year. And this poor teacher, thank God we weren't virtual because she probably couldn't have, but she sustained a pretty extensive concussion from being on the playground equipment with a student. And you know, she still struggles to look at the screen for any length of time. And she was apologizing to me, she didn't have her progress reports done. And I was like, what can I do to help you? Like, if you want me to type and you tell me, I'll write it, because I do know she's struggling right now being on the computer for any length of time. And I would have what she would say a mild concussion, but it is still impacting her. And she's only, I would say 4 weeks out. She's only a month out. And so she went back to the doctor, all these fun workman comps claims that are occurring. So she's had to follow up, and the doctor was like, well, gosh, I hope it improves. If it doesn't improve until, another month out, you need to come back. But definitely looking at effects may not emerge immediately. So definitely in children who've had one, we don't necessarily see all the things. And who's the typical person with a TBI? Really, it can be anybody. Here's what we know. Like I said, we don't ever want to discount, but more males to females obviously are higher risk, of 4-to-1 ratio. 15 to 25 years of age. And abuse of alcohol is another leading risk factor. I would say anybody who engages in sports. So what I will say that I hope you guys have seen, if any of you are involved in youth sports, they do a concussion protocol, which that is newer in the last 10 years, which is great. I think that's awesome. I think we're more aware of what a concussion can do to somebody, as well as following through. So there are other things like inpatient rehab programs. Definitely, I recommend that for anybody who's been in a coma. And then of course we move to outpatient. So there's like acute and then post-acute. So to me, acute is inpatient. There's critical, where they're like what I would say in the hospital still getting treated for their immediate injury. And then there's acute, where they kind of move to they're not quite ready to go home, but they're not in what I would say critical states, but they still need that medical assistant. So we call it acute. And then post-acute is usually, or sometimes there's what I would call short-term rehab facilities. I highly recommend that for anybody who's been in a coma. And then of course, outpatient support afterwards. So kind of that immediate hospital, kind of that some hospitals, some rehab, and then kind of that post-rehab placement where you're getting your services every day. Because what we know is the quicker you're able to respond and to participate in those therapies, the better your outcome is. So if we learn nothing, it's that they need lots of intervention right away. And then some residential. So for instance, or long-term supported living. So my co-therapist, she had what I would call, like her cousin or her sister. I don't think she technically was a family member, but she considered her a family member, and she was a nurse practitioner. She was in a serious car accident. And she's never going to be able to work again as a nurse practitioner. She had been at St. Joe's for a long time. She had done the whole gamut. Now she's living in what we would call a neuro rehabilitation transitional living. And this is about a year out. She's still making gains, but it's kind of like she's not safe to be at home. And she doesn't really have a support system of living with a parent. She has 4 children of her own. And I don't think living at her ex-husband's house was going to work either. So she is in what we would call like a transitional living before she goes on her own. And then we're not real sure what kind of job she can sustain. So they're kind of doing some of that job rehab work since she's no longer going to be able to return to be a nurse practitioner. So, which is sad. That's so sad to me because of the long-term effects and the extensive damage that she had. So that's some of the presentation. So if you learn nothing else, no 2 TBIs are alike. No two TBIs have the same recovery period. And something mild can affect somebody more than versus something severe. And sometimes I want to say this, and this is maybe critical of our healthcare in the US, is sometimes those mild TBIs, or what we would label mild, and it is impacting them more than one would expect for a variety of reasons. And oftentimes it's about the location of where the minor TBI occurred. I think we don't have good healthcare that supports that intensive rehab part. So what I see sometimes is someone who has an extensive injury gets all the rehab and services that they need to recover. So sometimes their outcome is better than someone who's had a mild injury because they didn't have those resources and things available to them. So sometimes the mild injury can be more impactful long-term versus something more severe and immediate, but because they had the right treatment and therapy afterwards, they have made, I don't ever want to say a full recovery, but their recovery has been almost back to their pre-existing condition versus someone who's had a mild and not had all that intervention and it's impacted them. Then that kind of is what I would call that that domino effect. So something mild impact them, and then it kind of then impacts them long-term, longer and more, versus someone who's had that initial, had all that support, and then they've kind of recovered, and then they don't have that long-term part. So I always believe in as much therapy, rehab, and support you can get right away after a TBI, you absolutely need to capitalize on that. So we have a TBI reaction video, traumatic brain injury observation, a short quiz, and a read and review summary. So get those done this week. Focus on module 10. If you've not finished module 10, try to get module 10 and 9 up to speed, because I kind of want to get us all on pace by the end of module 12. So 13, 14, 15, 16, kind of that next phase of the our modules we can get on track. So brain injury assessment, look up the words, understand the difference between open and closed, be aware of kind of some of the ways we assess a brain injury and kind of the different areas. So a lot of times what we see is that what are some of the challenges they might have? And again, most of the time it depends on where the injury occurred, but we know they can have balance problems. We know they can have vestibular issues. We know that they can have attention memory challenges. We know that their ability to concentrate might be impacted. Some, vision, they can definitely have blurry vision. That's what I think my coworker, she was telling me today, she's really struggling. And of course, this fun AZ Merit, for those of you who are familiar with it, that starts tomorrow at our school anyway. And it's all on the computer. And we switched spots. I said, okay, I will do your small group testing for AZ Merit since it's on the computer. And she was just saying on the computer, she's really having blurry vision. And that's been her biggest, and she already wears glasses to begin with. She's like, I was blind to start with, now it's extra. And she was worried about that as far as doing AZ Merit testing. So we made some adjustments based on that. But what do we know? We know you have a TBI, you can absolutely have now issues with your vision. We also know you've had a TBI, now all of a sudden you can have seizures that you didn't have before. So these are things that we watch out for. And then the biggest challenge, you guys, I want to say about TBI is that when we work with our clients, and this holds true for our young adult our young population, our young adult population, as well as our, what I would call our geriatric population, that if they have a disability, a lot of times then that puts them at higher risk for then having a traumatic brain injury. So for instance, someone who has some mobility issues definitely has risk for falling. Someone who has challenges with, regulating themselves. Like, I wish I knew how many clients with autism now have have had a brain injury because of their other inability to regulate themselves, or their inhibition isn't there. So they're willing to jump off of things or climb up things that's not safe. Those kind of challenges, I think sometimes a primary disorder can then put them at risk for a TBI as a secondary disorder. And we've had that. So someone who maybe has ADHD, impulsive, do something impulsive, and then now have a traumatic brain injury from the result of the impulsive action. So kind of TBI is also what I would call the secondary factor of, you've got a primary disability. Depending on what that is, that can put you now at risk for having a traumatic brain injury. And depending on your communication skills or ability to relate that information, or ability for us to assess that, we may not know the extent, or we may not understand that you actually have had a traumatic brain injury. So there's some things with that too. Just be aware of, especially if we have clients who do self-injurious behavior. A lot of times you would hope they're not that severe, but it can be. So those are some other factors that we have to consider. You have concerns about, say you're working with a client, your average receptive and expressive delay, you're seeing different behaviors. Mom and dad talk about, them falling off their bike last week, or some kind of other event that happened that you think, hey, now we're seeing different changes. Those are things to alert to your supervisor. So your supervisor could kind of assess that or research a little bit more, or tell the parents, hey, we're seeing these signs now. This is something you need to go talk to a doctor about. So some things like that. Cheer is another one, high risk of concussion, as well as gymnastics. It's not just male sports, although cheer and gymnastics are predominantly female sports, but there are also males that do that too. So I don't want to discriminate that way, but think about, what do your clients do during the day? What are some of their outside activities? And you're seeing strange or different behaviors that you weren't seeing before, but they kind of align with this. That's something to definitely alert your supervisor to. So any other questions? I am taking due dates off. And like I said, no one's being counted late. So if you haven't finished, the midterm, finish up the midterm. If you haven't done module 9, do module 9. Module 10, if you're up to speed on all that, focus on getting module 10 done this week. And I'll give you some more updates soon, but no one's being counted late for anything. So if you don't have it and you want to turn it in, get it in. Any other questions? Okay, if not, I appreciate everybody joining me and you guys working with us through this whole computer issue that we've had this semester. And if you have any other questions or concerns, please send me a message right away. And if I haven't responded to somebody's message and you need to, send me another message, say, hey, you didn't respond to that. Please respond.